Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
Welcome to this edition of Midweek Geek here on Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. As always, real quick, if you're watching this on YouTube, do not hesitate to hit that subscribe button because I very much appreciate it. I know you don't have to subscribe to anything on YouTube, so I very much appreciate even the consideration of subscribing. And if you do, it really means the world to me. I'm making a push in 2019 to reach just 1,000 subscribers. So if you help me do that, that's awesome because I know you don't have to help. But if you like Geek Therapy Radio, if you like what we're all about here at Geek Therapy Radio, then make sure you hit that subscribe button there on YouTube. If you're listening to this on the podcast, if you just discovered this podcast, make sure you're all subscribed to that as well on your favorite podcast app. Of course, we here at iHeartMedia prefer the iHeartRadio app. That is our favorite, but you can also get it on iTunes and Spreaker and Pocket Casts, and I gotta check on Spotify, but you can get it on a whole ton of podcast apps. Just search Geek Therapy Radio. Well, you're already listening to it. It doesn't matter. And this isn't airing on the air because it's just my podcast-only version. So obviously, if you're already listening to this, you've already found the show. Just make sure you hit that plus button or the subscribe button, whatever it is, on your podcast app. Now, let's move right into it. But before I get to the main topic of the show, I promise this is all geeky stuff. This is not an ad or anything like that. We're going to talk about vintage computers here on Midweek Geek this week, what it means to me, what it means to a lot of people, just kind of dig into the psychology of using vintage computers in 2019. You know, computers 20, 30, maybe 40 years old. Well, not maybe quite that old. Maybe, though. What's 40 years old right now, 2019? 1979? Commodore, the VIC-20? Was that out in about 1979-ish? I think so. Anyways, so vintage computers up to 40 years old, using them for any reason other than just pure nostalgia, which is a part of it in 2019. Real quick, I just wanted to touch on something fascinating that I just read on Ars Technica, and it was talking about, we're talking about painting here, we're talking about art, we're talking about portraits. The Mona Lisa effect, as it's known, and that is, and we've all experienced this, most of us have experienced this, you're looking at a painting, and as you're walking around the room with the portrait on the wall, you can swear that the eyes are following you. It's a very old trope in comedies and horror pictures and films, but it's a very real effect. You get the sensation that you can swear the eyes of the portrait, like the Mona Lisa, are following you around the room. So that's called the Mona Lisa effect. And why this is interesting, why I'm even talking about it right now, before we get into vintage computers, is that a group of researchers recently finally they tested the Mona Lisa effect on the Mona Lisa, and they found that the Mona Lisa isn't affected by the Mona Lisa effect. That is, test subjects for the Mona Lisa, much less than other paintings, felt that the Mona Lisa wasn't really following them around the room, that her gaze wasn't really following them around the room. So the Mona Lisa effect effectively doesn't even apply to the Mona Lisa. And I just thought that was fascinating. Even more fascinating, even further, is that it is suspected that since Leonardo da Vinci, who not only did the Mona Lisa, but did all sorts of, he was a scientist, he did all sorts of experiments, but he painted the Mona Lisa, he was a very brilliant man, and researchers now think that since he was so smart, that he specifically designed and painted the Mona Lisa, painted her gaze to be just on that verge of enacting the Mona Lisa effect. He put her gaze at just so many degrees. It's like 4.5 degrees or something like that. Just right there at that precipice of making people think, is she following me? Is she not following me? Are eyes looking at me all the time? Are they not? He purposefully put it right there on the edge, knowing about the effect, because before the Mona Lisa effect, the effect was still there. It just wasn't dubbed the Mona Lisa effect. So he knew about that effect of the eyes following you around the room, and he put her gaze, I believe it's just off to her left, as she's sitting there. He put it at just so many degrees that it would make you go crazy wondering if she was or wasn't actually following you around the room. Like, he knew that. There's so much mystique around the Mona Lisa, and this just adds all the more mystique that Da Vinci knew about the effect, and he purposefully created the Mona Lisa to be just on the verge of that effect. I thought that was fascinating. Okay, we're 5 minutes into the segment here, so let's move on to vintage computers like I promised. If you're watching on YouTube, of course I put the timestamps all nice and neat up above my head here, and as I point to it, I'll make it disappear and turn into vintage computers. So, what got me on the subject for to cover on Midweek Geek here this week is I went on eBay this week and I was bidding on an Atari ST. Specifically an Atari ST FM. It has a frequency modulator on the back. You can plug it into a TV. Has the disk drive built in. It's a 16-bit computer from about the mid-'80s or so. And I was bidding on it, and I think I put my bid at like $183. And I was winning the auction. And then I remembered why I hated this certain aspect of eBay, because at the last 2 or 3 seconds, someone outbid me by like a penny or $1. It's like, oh yeah, I remember why I don't bid on stuff on eBay anymore. Someone swooped into the last few seconds. So before I could outbid him, the auction was just over. So he swooped in at the last second and got me. But I was bidding on a vintage computer, that Atari ST, technically STFM, but popularly it's known as the Atari ST. I have, as you remember, you're good. I'm going to keep talking, though. I have a Commodore 64. A lot of you listeners might remember that I bought that. I bought that a couple years ago, and I had to. Have a good night. I had to go pick that Commodore 64 up in my DeLorean. I didn't have a choice. I don't mean like I didn't have another car. I don't mean that I didn't have another car capable. Hold on one second. I'm going to put a pause break in here. Okay, so as I was saying, I went to pick up my vintage Commodore 64 in my vintage early 80s DeLorean. So early 80s computer, early 80s vehicle. Had to do it because I'm a geek. We're all geeks. So I'm on this vintage computer kick. I can see that it's something that I'm going to get into, that I can get into, that I will amass not a huge collection of vintage computers, but I might own 1 or 2 computers kind of from each era. So I have the Commodore 64, that's 8-bit. The Atari ST that I'll get eventually, that's 16-bit. And I think it went up to 32 bits eventually. What did it change into? That was 32 bits. Anyways, then I'll get a 32-bit computer and blah, blah, blah. I can see myself amassing a very small collection of vintage computers. But I got onto this vintage computer kick in a roundabout way, as happens to us geeks. We start looking into one subject, we look into something, and it puts us off on a tangent that we didn't know about before going into the original subject. So, for instance, I was looking for a good word processor, the best word processor software for the Commodore 64. And for those of you who don't know, it's an old program called GEOS, G-E-O-S. It was a word processor contained in there. It was an old GUI, an old graphics user interface coded for the Commodore 64 and other vintage computers. So I booted it up, I loaded it up, and it was good, but not great. There's a reason why Microsoft Word is what it is right now in 2019. You can tell the stark differences between a word processor from the 80s or early 90s and modern Microsoft Word. So that got me thinking, as far as vintage computers go, what's a good word processor for a reasonably old or useful vintage computer? And I stumbled upon WordPerfect. Some listeners might remember the program called WordPerfect. It came out for the Atari ST, probably came out for the Commodore 128. Don't quote me on that. It came out for a bunch of different platforms, IBM compatible, all that stuff. So WordPerfect for the Atari ST. So what do you think I did? I went to eBay to look for an Atari ST. And just side notes, a decent vintage computer of really any era, and this varies widely. But I would say plan to set aside $200 or $300 for such an endeavor to get a good example of a vintage computer. Plan on about $200. I think you can get. I mean, that's not to say that you can't get really lucky and score one for free or score one at thrift shop for $10. But if you want one that's like refurbished and has really been set up nice by a good electrician who knows what he's doing, he's changed out the caps, changed out some chips maybe. You want to get a good working example of a vintage computer, plan on a few $100, up to thousands. But I would say at the low end, in between $100 and $300. So anyway, Atari ST, I saw one about $200. Now, why? This got me thinking, why now, through this hunt for word processor, vintage word processing software, gets me further on this vintage computer kick? Why didn't it just end when I got the Commodore 64 a couple years ago? So I did a lot of grappling, a lot of emotional turmoil and mental excursions to figure out why. What is the appeal of vintage computers? It can't just be, I know in a lot of cases that it's just nostalgia. Let's not beat around the bush here. It's pure nostalgia for a simpler time. Or maybe we grew up with these machines as kids. We couldn't afford to get good ones. So now that we're older and they're relatively cheap, we can afford to get the fully spec'd out machine that we yearned for as a kid. Now we can get it. As adults. So that's part of it. Back in the day, they were thousands of dollars for the fully spec'd out version. Back in the 80s and 70s and 90s, thousands of dollars. Now you can pick them up for a couple $100. That seems pretty good. But nostalgia plays a big role in it. But for me, and I think for a lot of people who use vintage computers almost day to day, we share this idea. And I'm going to let you guys know about it because I want your input on it, and I want you, even for listeners who aren't so hip to vintage computers or computers in general, there's this idea that I think connects to a lot of people, whether or not you're interested in electronics or computers or not. That is, with old vintage computers in this case, and why I want a word processor on a vintage computer, vintage computers by their nature, by their limitations, do not allow for all the distractions we have on modern computers. As I'm recording this episode of Midweek Geek here on Geek Therapy Radio, I have a bunch of tabs open here. We're using Windows 7 at the station. But a modern PC, you can have your Facebook up on one tab. You can have, I have Flight Simulator on a PC behind me right now on my laptop, Flight Simulator running. I have all sorts of different apps and applications, and there's also an email. There's all sorts of distractions that can distract you. Let's say you want to get into a writing mode. You just want to write. I like to write here for Geek Therapy Radio a lot. And as you heard, I experiment with it because I also have a blog on the radio station websites, KPRC and 94.5 The Buzz and everything like that. So I more and more I write out a lot of stuff for the show. Not just show prep, but like kind of scripts that I know that will work well for the blog. So I'm writing a lot of stuff, and I need to focus on writing. And sometimes it's hard to focus on writing when we're using a modern computer with all the distractions. So that is what got me on the search for a good word processor for a vintage computer. With a vintage computer, you can't, even if you wanted to, have the distractions. It's very hard to even multitask on old computers. Sometimes they don't even have 16-bit wave playback, meaning you can't even listen to waves, let alone decode MP3s. So what I'm saying is, if I open up a good word processor on a vintage computer, my focus and all of my mental energy is focused on the writing. It's the same reason why a lot of people, Conan O'Brien has commercials on where he's using a vintage typewriter when he quote unquote feels like going analog. But you use those old distraction-free devices to get the real work done without checking emails and Facebook and playing games. That's what got me on this new vintage computer kick, and I don't think I'm alone in that. There's a lot of millennials now who take vacations on purpose to go off-grid. They try to find little bastions here in the United States and probably abroad, little bastions, areas of wilderness where there is no 4G LTE, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no cell service, there's no nothing. they try to get off grid to reconnect and focus with themselves or with nature, with their art, with their hobbies, whatever. And that's very fascinating to me. I'm going to pause real quick here to reset the camera. 1 second. So maybe whether we realize it or not, in my case, trying to use vintage computers to create distraction-free writing environment, I think a lot of us, it's not just nostalgia. It's like it's requirement. It's something deep in our hearts, in our souls, in the core of our being, in our evolution that needs to disconnect. I'm sure even in not prehistoric times, but early man, as we coagulated into groups and created, little mini societies, we had clans and then we had cities and towns and da-da-da. But I'm sure even the earliest humans, even in their little group of a dozen or so people in a tribe, you needed to get away. I'm sure that they felt at times that there was too much going on. They needed to work on something. They needed to work on their art, their geek thing back then. And they just needed to get away to do it distraction-free or use something simpler to get the job done. It's almost like, I'll relate this to gamers. If you're a hardcore gamer and you just have so many video games, I have in my Steam library on my PC, I probably have, this is a small library, I think. I have dozens of video games, PC games on my laptop in my Steam library that I've paid for. Out of those maybe 50 or 60 games, how many games do I play out of them on a regular basis? 2 or 3 maybe. Rocket League, Street Fighter, and that's pretty much it. Out of all the games I've spent money on, out of my entire library, I stick to those 2 or 3. I think that's kind of what we do, or what we're yearning for. Let's say when you pick up a Moleskine notebook, you could use your laptop, you could use your phone, but you need something distraction-free that serves its one purpose. For the Moleskine notebook, it's just to use a pencil or a pen and jot down a note. Distraction-free. It's not to whip out your phone and use a stylus or whatever and tap in your notes on your phone. While you're at it, check your Facebook and Instagram and all these different things, all these distractions. It's, no, I need to get this idea down. And it's, for one thing, it's faster just to write things down a lot of times. But the point is, you use the Moleskine because you need to focus. You want to focus on what the task is at hand without distraction. So that's what I like. That is my appeal. One of the strong appeals to vintage computers isn't just the nostalgia. It isn't just to yearn back for a simpler time in the video games that I grew up with or whatever, playing it on Commodores or NESs or whatever. It serves a practical purpose. Just like some writers use typewriters. It serves a purpose so you can focus in on that goal. Now, I'm not saying that you can't stay focused using Microsoft Word on a new computer here in 2019. You absolutely can. But there's the temptation for distraction. There's the temptation to multitask. And if you want to get real work done, you remove the limitation. And the best way to remove limitations, in my mind right now, getting into vintage computers, is to get that vintage computer that physically can't multitask, that physically doesn't have the distractions. I don't think I'm alone in that. I really, really don't. And again, I'm talking about vintage computers. It could be whatever you're into. It could be something going on in your life, something that you realize there's just too many distractions here. Maybe your desk is too cluttered with stuff. You just want to go back to a smaller desk because you just can't physically put as many things on a smaller desk. I think that's the draw and the appeal for me getting a vintage computer that has a good word processor on it. I don't think it's just justification. Yes, that it is justification, but it is actually just justification. Like, it is a righteous justification for wanting this device. And at least I keep telling myself that. Maybe I should just crack the whip and say, no, focus on using this word processor on Windows 10. Just focus on using it on this modern machine. But for a lot of us, it's easier said than done. We can't even do it if we wanted to. Emails beep. Our phone beeps with stuff, text messages, things coming in, things distracting you that you can't help, outside forces from the outside working their way in to distract you. That's why I like vintage computers, not just in the nostalgia, but to serve a practical purpose, to simplify the workflow, to create higher quality work. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for listening to my rant there. Maybe I rambled on a little bit, but I think it's going to strike a chord with some people. I think a lot of people are going to relate to this, like I said, in your own area of geekdom. Balsa wood airplanes, as opposed to all the servos and different controllers and modules on a modern RC aircraft, 6, 7 channels, whatever, ailerons and flaps and things, and all these servo motors and remote controllers and wires running everywhere and Wi-Fi things and antennas. It's just nice to sit there with a balsa wood airplane and a rubber band propeller. Just wind it up, let it go. You can focus more on aerodynamics. You can tweak things, put a quarter on the front of it, tweak the CG, center of gravity. You get what I'm saying. Sometimes it's nice just to simplify and focus on what really matters. And I think that applies to a lot of areas of life that can really do our geek heart good. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, consider subscribing. It means a lot even just for you to consider subscribing. If you like it, maybe share it with friends. You know, am I onto something here with this idea of increasing, decreasing distractions in life? I think I am onto something. Until the big show later on this week, Geek Therapy Radio. By the way, mark your calendars. In February, Geek Therapy Radio will air now in Houston on KPRC 950 AM at 10 p.m. Saturday nights. It moves from midnight. So now I'm on when people are awake. 10 p.m. Saturday nights, Geek Therapy Radio, KPRC 950 AM, starting in February. Thank you for all the support. It means a lot to me. Take care, everybody. Until next week, be good to each other, including yourself. Please be good to yourself. It makes being good to each other easier if you just remember to be good to yourself as well. Indulge in your geek thing. Find a new geek thing and embrace your geek thing. Until next time, I'm Johnny Hemberger, your mental curator. Adios.